यहाँ दिख रहा भाई कितना मज़ा आ रहा है, ठंडी हवा, सामने सूरज, कितना पब्लिक, इंटरेस्टिंग, काफ़ी मज़ा आ रहा होती है, अच्छा लग रहा हो।
Okay, welcome back to our third and last session of the Inhospitable World. So for session 3, distribution, exhibition, and spectatorship of Asian films in pandemic time. And my name is QI Chu. I'm an assistant professor of NTU, Nanyang Technological University, and also the guest curator of the Inhospitable World. And here's my colleague, Sang-Jun Lee, assistant professor of Nanyang Technological University as well, and also the moderator of this session. So for this session, we are very happy to have with us 3 speakers and 2 film scholars and a festival programmer. So this panel examines how film production, distribution, and exhibition, as well as spectatorship have been affected by the inhospitable conditions of our present world, particularly made worse by the global environmental crisis and more recently the pandemic environment. So how are the local film scenes responding to the changes, and can online film experience replace cinemas, festivals, and conventional modes of spectatorships? How are film circuits, festivals, and audience viewing patterns being redefined in this age of Anthropocene and the post-pandemic times, particularly in various parts of Asia, as well as the screening of Asian films in other parts of the world? So I'll pass the time to Sang-Jun to introduce our speakers.
Okay, thank you, QI. I'm so happy to introduce today's 3 speakers. We have 3 distinguished speakers, 2 from the academia and 1 from the film festival professional world. Our first speaker is Professor Gina Marchetti. I think before I introduce Gina, I think I want to show, Gina, can you see this book, right? So I first read her book, this one, From Tiananmen to Times Square, at a graduate seminar a long time ago in 2006. It was one of the first books I read about Hong Kong cinema. It really helped me to shape my research and my future, my dissertation and so on. So Gina Marchetti is a professor at the Department of Comparative Literature and also director of the Center for the Study of Globalization and Cultures at the University of Hong Kong. She teaches courses in film, gender and sexuality, critical theory, and cultural studies. She is the author of many books, including Romance and the Yellow Peril, Race, Sex, and Discursive Strategies in Hollywood Fiction, which came out in 1993, and From Tiananmen to Times Square, Transnational China and the Chinese Diaspora on Global Screen in 2006, The Chinese Diasporas on American Screen, Race, Sex, and the Cinema in 2012, and Infernal Affairs, the trilogy, came out in 2007, Inciting China, Politics, Postmodernism, and World Cinema in 2018. Her talk today is Hong Kong on Borrowed Time in a Pandemic. Please welcome Gina.
Thank you. I'm going to share my PowerPoint now. And I want to thank you, and I especially want to thank you for mentioning my book. You know, I wrote part of that book while I was teaching at NTU many years ago. And there's a chapter in it on Eric Koo's films. So invite anyone who's interested in knowing more about what I have to think about Singaporean films as well to have a look at From Tiananmen to Times Square. But today I'm going to talk about Hong Kong and Hong Kong on borrowed time in a pandemic. So I'm going to focus on time. I know the panel today is primarily about spectatorship and exhibition and those issues. And I want to talk a bit about the curation of this particular film festival in relationship to how we're experiencing time right now in Hong Kong. So there's a project I invite you all to look at when you have a chance on the empty theaters with the free space doing this kind of series of video responses to empty theaters. It's kind of interesting because it's a commentary on how we're experiencing space right now, particularly cinematic space. Now, I'm going to talk about the other side of that. I'm going to talk about how we're experiencing time and how the time we experience through the cinema has an impact on how we're looking at the pandemic and how we feel about the pandemic. A lot of scientists, and I'll just go through a few right now, a lot of scientists have talked about the fact that we're experiencing time differently now because of the pandemic, that we have a different sense of our own personal time, how quickly or slowly time is passing, as well as we have a new sense of time in terms of how much time we spend on screen ourselves, such as right now where we're on Zoom or we're on different webinar software, so that digital time. We can experience time too in terms of news and news items. We figure out that we've got a sense of time that's a timeline, that we're somewhere on a timeline that's a pandemic narrative that we're all living through right now, and that this narrative had a beginning in Wuhan and that, supposedly in Wuhan, and that we're still experiencing it on a global scale. So our sense of time has to do with how we're situating ourselves along how we feel about that timeline, whether we feel the pandemic is at a peak or is about to end, or we're turning a corner or not. Now, in terms of our experiencing of this time, there's a lot of scientific evidence to show that the pandemic is giving us a sense of time that impacts on our own emotions, our anxieties, our experiences of distortion of time, the fact that we feel that we're that somehow time is never in our control, but we really feel that even more strongly now because of the pandemic. So when we look at the sense of time, we have a different experience of the past, the present, and the future as a result. And I invite you to look at some of these essays about that when you have a chance. Now, when we think about experience of time, it's different for different people. And I think some of the more interesting research that's happening right now that really has an impact on some of the films I'm going to talk about today has to do with income and class, that actually people who are experiencing economic hardships have a different sense of time than those of us who might still be doing our jobs and feel more secure, that people have a different sense of time depending on where they are on the class hierarchy and what types of jobs they're doing. I also wanted to point out that this is nothing new, that Donald Lowe, several years ago in 1982, as a matter of fact, wrote a book on the history of bourgeois perception, which he has a whole chapter on how class and economic factors impact our feelings about time, how we experience time. So I wanted to point that out as well. Now, of course, gender is an important factor, and I think this resonates a lot with what went on in the first panel this morning here at the conference, where people were talking about the way in which women are experiencing the pandemic differently. Now, of course, women experience time differently in any case, in terms of cycles and in terms of life cycles, etc. The way in which we organize our domestic time in relationship to our working time. And of course, there have been studies of this as well. Julia Kristeva wrote a very important essay called Women's Time that's been critiqued by people, among them Emily Apter. And she also wrote a book that Emily Apter doesn't talk about. She only talks about the essay, that I wanted to point out because it's also relevant today. And that is, she wrote a book about Chinese women, in which she talks also about the experience of time as both we have to factor in both gender and culture and politics when we think of that time. So Chinese women experience time differently in terms of, under Mao, in terms of political time, political movements and political upheaval, etc. So I'm going to be talking about this again today. COVID-19 and women's time. When we look at COVID-19 specifically and how it impacts women, we realize that the way in which women are experiencing time is different. And some of that's career time, women who are having their careers set back because of COVID. It's also in terms of the reorganization of domestic time with kids in the house that would normally be out at school, the idea of a second shift turning into an endless shift because work time and domestic time are bleeding into each other. And then also in terms of our university sense of time. I can't tell you how much I feel it when I think about just asynchronous teaching, synchronous teaching, being with the students in the same time zone or having to teach students in a different time zone. So when you look at this, and I invite you to look at that a little bit, what I want to focus on today is how all of those factors, class, gender, etc., other aspects of status, come together with Hong Kong, specifically Hong Kong time. And of course, COVID-19 is not the first time people have talked about time in Hong Kong. Richard Hughes in 1968, of course, wrote a very famous book, Borrowed Place, Borrowed Time, Hong Kong. And this is very much about how Hong Kong still feels. That time it was a colony. After the negotiation of Hong Kong's of the joint declaration with the Sino-British Accord, there was a new sense of time till the handover in 97, and then post-handover, there's a new sense of time, the 50 years of one country, two systems. So there's this endless sense of Hong Kong always on a limited time, always having, as Wong Kar-wai has been quoted as saying, an expiration date. So I'm going to be talking about all of these factors factoring in. There was an issue recently of the Journal of Future Studies that I welcome you to take a look at, that looks at this particular problem of Hong Kong's political time. It's interesting because it came out, of course, during the height now of the COVID-19 crisis in September, but it's primarily dealing with Hong Kong protests from last year, with the 2019 protests. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later in relationship to what we're going through with COVID right now and how that relates to the cinema. Now, Hong Kong, historically, when we think about colonial period, when we think about post-colonial period, we also think about pandemic periods. I invite you to look at my colleague Robert Peckham's book, Pandemics in Modern Asia, which says a lot about why Hong Kong is so much at the epicenter of these waves of global pandemics over time. Some of them, I'll just mention a few. 1894 bubonic plague, 1938 smallpox, 1961 cholera outbreak, 1968 Hong Kong flu, which went around the world, of course, 2003 SARS, which hit Hong Kong very hard in terms of per capita deaths. Okay? And then, of course, now the latest situation with COVID-19, Hong Kong being one of the first places outside of the borders of mainland China in which COVID-19 became extremely important factor in our day-to-day lives. Okay. Now, what about screen time during COVID-19? And that's what we're going to be talking about today as spectators. How are we experiencing screen time? And how does that relate to films that were made before the 2019, before the COVID crisis, or the COVID-19 crisis, before 2020? I'm going to be looking primarily at two that were part of this festival. One that is from the earlier days of Hong Kong from the colonial times, and then one that was just made last year in 2019. Now, pandemics and narrative. Okay. Earlier today, we talked a lot about, at this conference, we talked a lot about narrative time and how particularly outbreak narratives about epidemics have their own sense of time, with the patient zero leading into an investigation of what led to patient zero, and then the implications of the narrative in terms of the outbreak, looking for a cure, trying to get people on board with the cure, etc. So I'm going to be looking at some of that today. Now, when you look at just those narratives, those outbreak narratives like Priscilla Wall does in her book, you have to realize that it's also important to think about outbreak narratives as though that temporality intersects with the cinema. And the cinema and theorists of the cinema have always been talking about film's relationship to time. Andre Bazin is probably one of the best known when he said, well, actually, the cinematic duration is change mummified. That idea that you can capture duration in cinema in a way that no other art really can. Gilles Deleuze, more recently, before he passed away, looked back at Henri Bergson, another French theorist really of time, in his book on memory, and used his ideas to really think about the way in which cinema can crystallize time, and the way in which that time is a virtual time, that cinema can capture a sense of time that is only inside really our heads, in a way that no other art form can. So it's more than simply a chronology that's mummified. It's also an experience, a perception of time that is mummified. And we see that, of course, a lot in Hong Kong cinema. Why? Because we're always on edge because of our expiration dates. The master of that, as many critics have talked about, is, of course, Wong Kar-wai, who's made many, many films that highlight Hong Kong's particular sense of time, and that highlight the idea of time as an abstract concept in a way that's also quite poetic. Now, my former colleague from Hong Kong U, Akbar Abbas, wrote a book on Hong Kong culture and the politics of disappearance, in which he looks at a very specific kind of tense, a particular kind of time that he calls the déjà disparu, the already disappeared, as a particular expression of the way in which Hong Kongers experience time in the post-colonial moment. And in the case of the book, in the lead up to that post-colonial moment, in the lead up to 1997 and the handover. And what he puts his finger on is the fact that the way he saw this time was through the cinema. He sees that as the way in which the Hong Kong person is always someone running to catch up with something that's disappearing. And that continues on even after 97 because of the fact that we have a time limit on the one country, two systems as well. Earlier today, we talked about Stephen Soderbergh's Contagion, which was, of course, inspired by the 2003 SARS outbreak, with a lot of the action taking place in and around Hong Kong, including Macau, and the spillover of international finance and of disease, ecological disaster in relationship to Hong Kong. We also talked this morning, so I won't go into it too much right now, about the way in which women were used within the film to talk about these stories, in which women were seen as part of this global tale and living on their own time as well, both as having adulterous affairs, as frontline workers, as members of international organizations like WHO, etc. And of course, the upshot of the film, to give away the ending, of course, because what can I say? I'm here to give spoilers, is, of course, they go back, and it's environmental degradation that gave rise to the pandemic, which is probably what happened in 2003, probably what happened in 2019 as well, that there was a leap of a virus from wildlife into the human food chain and then into the human population. Now, to get to the films that I'm going to talk about today, pre-SARS, pre-COVID, Patrick Leung made a film called Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow in 1970. And a lot of people, including Tom Cunliffe, and I invite you to read his excellent essay from Screen Magazine about the film, talk about it in relationship to the 1967 riots, which were a spillover from the Cultural Revolution in China at the time, a very anti-colonial expression of dissatisfaction. Now, what he did was take The Plague, Albert Camus' book, which was also seen at the time that it was written as an allegory of Nazism and the way in which Nazism took over like a plague of France and of the French territories. But also, both the book and the film are very much seen as narratives, as these outbreak narratives, as also studies of the time, the way in which we experience time, and the way in which characters, fictional characters, experience time as they live through an epidemic. When we look at the progression of time in Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, I need to point out one thing to you, and that is the fact that the film came out 2 years after Hughes wrote his book, and the film is based on the three sections of that book. Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow refers not simply to the progression of the pandemic, but also to the changes of the colony. So it was very much, the title of the film is pretty much the same in Chinese and in English. It was very much a direct reference to the way in which people were thinking about borrowed place, borrowed time in the wake of the riots, but also at the same time as the Hong Kong flu was gripping the world. There have been many other films from Hong Kong about pandemics, including Ebola syndrome. Golden Chicken references, Golden Chicken 2 references directly SARS. City of SARS, once again, directly references SARS. Other Hong Kong films as SARS. Earlier today, we mentioned 199 Shorts, the short films that were made as a response to SARS that were funded by the Information Services Department of the Hong Kong government. And many filmmakers, you can see the list here, many of the best-known filmmakers in Hong Kong contributed to that project. Several of them are available on YouTube. I highly recommend you go have a look at some of those films. Now, today, I want to really focus on, and to wrap up, I really want to focus on a film by Bo Wong and Pan Lu, two filmmakers who've made several films about Hong Kong. Now, they made a film which came out in 2019 and circulating actually in festivals like this one right now, called Many Undulating Things. Now, this was made before COVID was known about, but in the wake of especially 2003 and SARS, I think that Hong Kong is still pictured and experienced as a place through pandemic times, that people were thinking about that then and now even more so because of COVID. It's an essay film, and I'm going to, as you know, with an essay film, many images and scenes and ideas are juxtaposed in rather poetic ways. I'm going to reorganize a little bit just to make it a little bit clearer how. And I'm only going to talk about one section of the film, and you've seen the whole film, which has a lot to do with Hong Kong as a port, with the Hong Kong environment, with environmental issues, with our lived space and architecture, the way in which we experience the city. I'm only going to focus on one section of this film, which deals specifically with Hong Kong as a pandemic city. So let me start here. And all of the images I'm going to be showing you right now, unless I say otherwise, are images that the filmmakers of Many Undulating Things reference. So we have a sense immediately of reference to colonialism, Europe, and the changes that were taking place through the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, etc., with the opening of the Silk Road through Marco Polo, and then subsequent voyages, etc., that were making the world much smaller at that point in time. And with that came, of course, the spread of disease. because with people mingling who hadn't mingled before, there was more disease that was coming in. So they show you some of the responses. And in medieval times, of course, the response was on religious time, a sense of a change and stories that have to do with the soul and the progress of the soul, a very different sense of disease than later, when disease was seen from a scientific point of view, rather than as something that you endure, that you experience in terms of a trial that you need to be redeemed from, as your soul would be redeemed, but more in a sense of botanical time. And the way this coincided, of course, with the configuration of the great empires, including, of course, the British Empire, and with figures like Joseph Banks, who's referenced in the film, and Kew Gardens, bringing plants in from the different parts of the empire. And then also with the advent of science in other ways, moving beyond that, the link between science and race, which is made quite explicit in the film, where you have the same person who is Linnaeus, who is talking about classifying plants and classifying animals, who's also classifying people into races and giving this kind of racist slant to things. There was also a lot going on in terms of theories of disease with scientists. And there was a huge controversy over whether germs cause disease or whether bad air, miasma, causes disease. Now, it's interesting because, of course, we know germs cause disease like COVID, but we also understand that environmental factors lead to the spread of germs. So that idea that, we have to worry about aerosols, of the way in which air circulates, the way in which germs circulate, is something that's part of what we go through today. And they quote many pictures of this because as the empire was expanding and as germs were circulating through the empire, there was a lot of racial animosity that we still feel today with COVID-19 as well that accompanied that. Britain came in with all kinds of sense of its own rights and its own sense of imperial time that it was using in order to handle these outbreaks, in order to rationalize these outbreaks. Now, the film does another interesting thing. It references a Hollywood film going from the British colonial time to the post-war period, and of course, neocolonial ascendancy of America during the Cold War, particularly in the wake of the Korean War. And it references the film Love is a Many Splendored Thing, and I wrote a book called Romance in the Yellow Peril, in which I have a chapter that includes a lengthy discussion of this film. But I'm going to talk about it in a different way now because Many Undulating Things points out aspects of the film that are quite different of what I pointed out in the book. Here we get a sense of the medical profession, in this case being feminized, through the character of Han Soo-yin. The film is based on her memoir, or actually it's a novelization of her experiences in Hong Kong in the post-war period. And we have Han Soo-yin, who was a Eurasian doctor based in Hong Kong at that time, looking after patients and looking at the way in which the Many Undulating Thing frames it is by looking at the way in which environmental diseases and the vulnerability of Westerners to these diseases become part of that film. Now, in this case, Hollywood's camera's gaze is divided. So we have Han Soo-yin being looked at by a Chinese physician, one of her colleagues, who is a communist sympathizer. And then we also have her being looked at by Western men, by British colonials, whom she can never seem to get things right with, and then also with Americans, like the character played by William Holden here. This sense of constantly being under surveillance, being looked at, being supposedly from in the imperial eyes being looked after, but also being scrutinized and pigeonholed in a certain way. This feeling that she's inadequate as a woman, even though she's an accomplished doctor, is reinforced by the fact that William Holden has to come in and help her out. Okay. What I really love about the film, too, is how it talks about the way in which the environment and time come together and are shown on the film. So the film was shot in both Hong Kong and in California, and it's interesting the way the film points out how the climate is shown through lighting, etc., and the humidity in the air. Also in the film, we have a sense of time being different through ritual that the Hollywood filmmakers find quite exotic and also frightening. So at one point in the film, when they're having their kind of love tryst, there is a certain kind of feeling of foreboding because they look down from their hotel room onto a funeral, a traditional funeral, going on in the street below their hotel room. And next to that, or we have juxtaposed with that, their love scene in which they talk about the fact that people can't see, that people are not looking, that only lovers can really see what's going on. And we also have that sense of temporal dislocation when, of course, the lovers, ill-fated as they are, must say goodbye. And a lot of that cuts between Hong Kong as a place and California, where part of the film is shot, cutting back and forth between Hong Kong and California in order to create this sense of dislocation and the fact that these lovers will, of course, never meet. They're star-crossed, and the William Holden character goes off to his death. Okay, and we have that final farewell, what Akbar Abbas has said in his book, or called in his book, A Love at Last Sight. Now, when we see this referenced in many undulating things, we realize that this film has been shaped the way in which Hong Kong sees itself and experiences its own sense of time as dislocated, as separated, as coming to an inevitable end that may or may not have an ending that can be considered happy. Now, I wanted to make one last point, and that was the relationship right now between protests and pandemic time that I've already referred to. If yesterday and today and tomorrow referred 67 and 68 as the time in which we had both the 67 riots, anti-colonial riots, and the 68 Hong Kong flu, then right now we have both the anti-ELAB protests of last year, of 2019, that most people know about, as well as 2020 as the fact that we have COVID. The relationship, if you look at the two images that I've got here of the two periods in time, the reference to tear gas as well as the wearing of the masks because of the pandemics, you realize the fact that there's also a sense here in Hong Kong of a kind of cyclical time and a time where we don't know. How much is Hong Kong worth is what Richard Hughes asked in 68, and it's still a salient question more than 50 years later. What are we worth? How much is our time worth? What kind of worth do we have in COVID times? And what can the cinema tell us about that? So let me leave it at that. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for your always passionate, rich, and inspirational talk. There are a lot to digest. I'm pretty sure that we all have many questions about your talk and the content you provided today. So if you have any questions about Gina's talk, please leave your questions on YouTube and Facebook chat box. So we'll discuss about this after all three speakers finish their talks. So let's move on to our second speaker, Maran. So our second speaker, Maran, is an associate professor at the International Program of Japan in Asia Cultural Studies and the Program of Cinema Studies Graduate School of Humanities at Nagoya University in Japan. Her research interests include East Asian independent cinemas and film festival studies. She has published several journal articles and book chapters on that, including contributions to Chinese Film Festival's Site of Translation, which came out in 2017, and Japanese Cinema Book 2020. Currently, she is working on subjective filmmaking in post-war Japan. She is the author of Independent Filmmaking Across Borders in Contemporary Asia, which came out last year from Amsterdam University Press. Besides that, she has also curated and organized screening event of independent films at Osaka, Beijing, and Nagoya. So her talk today is Save the Cinema in Post-Pandemic Japan, an incomplete observation. I'm personally very curious about her talk because I just heard about the news that 2 of South Korea's art house movie theaters have just announced their closures. The things are getting worse in South Korea. At the same time, I also saw the news that the Demon Slayer, a new Japanese anime film, made a new record, new opening day record in the history of Japan. So. And then Maran is going to talk about mini theaters, the future of mini theaters, and the state of mini theaters. Please welcome Maran.
Thank you, Sanju. And I hope I have a chance to meet you in person. And it's my great honor to have such a wonderful opportunity to share some of my thoughts via the platform offered by Asian Film Archive. I'm very grateful for the invitation, and big thanks to Kai, QA, Sanjun, Lafi. I'm so excited to be part of this panel. And Gina's talk makes me to remember the good days when I was a PhD student at the University of Hong Kong. So today, next, this is my flow. Next, please. This is a flow of my talk. As you can see here, I will examine Japanese cinema culture in times of COVID and highlight the sectors of exhibition and distribution. Specifically, I look at the crisis of mini theaters in the pandemic. My main focus is on Save the Cinema, as you can see the hashtag here, which is a bottom-up community-initiated campaign, or we call it movement, which I think has essentially highlighted the systematic crisis of Japanese film industry and its declining cinephiliac, I would call movie-going culture. So I think it may really relates to what Sanjun just mentioned as a situation in South Korea. Next. So here, as you can see here, I offer you a screen grab from days ago. The reddish numbers highlighting the trend of COVID around the country. Seemingly, they are not so worrying as compared to the conditions in Europe or North America, where people are experiencing the second or the third waves. Next. However, I want to emphasize how actually in the mysterious operation of the anti-COVID battles, there is this discourse which is very prominent. It's called jishuku, self-restraint, voluntary restraint, promoted by the state. And I think it's very much neoliberal, since because of this, the responsibility seems, to be shifted upon the shoulders of the individuals or the individual operators and businesses, right? So part of the persuasion is called fuyo fukyo, which is to discourage the citizens and residents from doing the so-called non-essential and non-urgent things. So the situation is that, however mysterious Japan has been dealing with COVID, enforced lockdown measures are never implemented. Although the Japanese public bodies and organizations like universities and theaters have launched and enforced their own versions of regulations under the name of voluntary restraint, jishoku. Next. So here, however, I give you a very simplified timeline in pandemic Japan. As you can tell, before the nationwide state of emergency was declared in April, actually as early as in February, the Prime Minister Abe already demanded that sports and cultural events should be regulate themselves under the name of self-restraint, which directly led to the temporary closure of cinemas, including big chain cinemas as well as indie cinemas I'm going to talk about. And as you can see along the timeline, into September, actually movie theaters are allowed by the state to sell all their seats. Next. So when it comes to the title or the core issue of this talk, Save the Cinema, I think essentially it's about to save the mini theater. Next. And what do we mean? What do we talk about when we talk about mini theater? This image is the entrance lobby in the building where one local mini theater is located. It's called Nagoya Cinematic. Next. So mini theater, I just give everybody who may not be very familiar with its background a very kind of simplified kind of explanation. Mini theater, they emerged in the heat of distributing and exhibiting European American art film in the early 80s in Japan. So partially it was because of the diversification of movie-going audiences. And when the movie theaters as such emerged, people at that time commented that it triggered a new wave in film distribution. It's not to say that before the emergence of mini theater, such art house cinemas did not exist. It's just like since the 80s, it became a kind of paradigm. A certain mode, right, to emulate and to grow. So mini, basically it means the space, right? It has a single screen, but in the recent decade, you are witnessing a kind of upgrading mini theater, so they have multiple screens maybe. And I think what is very, very important is that mini theaters, they are distinguished with independent programming and curation. So for instance, I think they are very good at programming and exhibiting other cinemas, like art house cinema, auto films, independently produced films. In Japan, it's called jishuega, like a low budget DIY films. Sometimes it could be student works and cut films, pink films, and so on and so forth. So some of the mini theaters are not only exhibitor, they are also the distributor. Sometimes they publish their own like film, cinema related like materials and books. I think it's very important to understand how mini theater, the emergence of mini theater has to do with a cosmopolitan and very much open film culture in Japan, right? And also, I think the people often contrast mini theater with cinema complex, which I do not think we should approach them in such a dichotomous terms. However, this is a background when we talk about mini theater. Although I cannot elaborate on this here, I think it's very important to consider why the existence of mini theater is necessary and how come their well-being will be important to Japan's film culture at the time when a national film industry has already collapsed. By which I mean that Japanese film industry already entered a post-studio era since the 90s. So the major film studios are no longer dominating the industry, while the independent filmmakers, filmmaking bodies, and organizations, they are playing a major role. Next. And I will not read out these numbers, but I just want to give you an idea of the positioning of mini theaters in this kind of big picture. We may say that the industrial environment is already quite inhospitable for mini theaters. And maybe you know that some Japanese local cities, they do not have any types of movie theaters at all. And we can argue that a COVID pandemic has foregrounded the economic and cultural crisis of mini theaters. However, their current struggles, I want to argue, have been very much overshadowed by the attention paid to the mainstream film industry and also have been marginalized by the state policy. Next. So just give you a very, very brief idea. This is another mini theater in town. It's called Cinema Scole, founded in '83, and the founder was a Japanese filmmaker Wakamatsu Koji. And he was famous for soft pornography called Pinku Ega, which has a political radical edge. And he was one of the most important Japanese filmmakers in the 60s and 70s. This is the Cinema Scole. As you can see, this is everything they have. Very tiny little theatrical space. Next. And this is a cinema that I often go to. It's in my neighborhood. I just mentioned it. It's Nagoya Cinematheque. Next. This slide gives you a very basic idea about their programming, right? So in the coming month, in November, not only they have a Petrocosta retrospective, they also have some remastered French films from the 50s and 40s. And of course, the program and screen a lot of Japanese independent films without, I would argue, without this kind of space, like indie cinema, like mini theater, like Nagoya Cinematheque, and so on and so forth. It's very difficult for such independent films to find an exhibition outlet. Next. So, of course, there is a kind of alliance of mini theaters, among which Japanese Community Cinema Center is very important. And it is non-governmental alliance of mini theaters together with other alternative exhibition spaces and bodies like film museums, film archives, and so on and so forth. So I would say the Community Cinema Center also plays a major role in kind of dealing with the crisis faced up by the mini theaters. Next. Okay, here it's very important. I want to just kind of touch on something very basic about what the Japanese state has been doing, has been positioning regarding cinema, eiga. So on the left-hand side, right, it is not until 2001 that the Bunkacho, right, the Japanese kind of agency of cultural affairs, issued a basic act for the promotion of art and culture, which once and for all defined film as art. Okay, so this policy has laid the basis for several government-led initiatives to promote the Japanese cinema with the agency. For instance, they set up various subsidy programs to encourage film production, co-production, and also they encourage Japanese cinema's participation in overseas film festivals, and they cultivate young filmmakers and other film professionals from the country. So my point is, okay, despite all these progresses, cinema is still labeled under the category of media art according to this basic act, okay? Together with manga, animation, computer-generated art, and so on and so forth. So Japanese state has not really developed a more sophisticated, organic understanding about film culture, and therefore their up-down policies are very much in line with the neoliberal cultural policies emphasizing cool Japan and the so-called contents industry. And that is why maybe you would always see the top 10 Japanese best-selling films are invariably the adaptations of manga or kind of a series of animation works. Okay, so on the right-hand side, during the pandemic, the agency has launched several instruments of the so-called Emergency Comprehensive Aid Package for cultural art activities to aid freelance workers in the cultural activity, right? But and I think it's very important to point out that I'm so sorry about the small letters. Actually, the items 3 and items 4, which are related to organizations, they are more directly related to the fate and conditions of mini theaters. Next. And here, just give you a very simple idea about how many kind of projects are kind of filed and how many have been funded. Among the over 40,000 applications, the applications from film, cinema, and animation is around 2,000 something. Next. Okay, it is against all this background that we kind of have an understanding of the so-called Save the Cinema movement. Okay, so basically the idea is to establish a mini theater aid. Okay, and as you can see, this is a capture from this motion gallery, which is crowdfunding platform. Okay, and it's very, very impressive, right? Because this crowdfunding initiative was launched in April and wrapped up in May. And basically, it's mainly supported and led by a younger generation Japanese filmmakers, indie filmmakers, I want to emphasize, and producers, right? So the filmmakers themselves are very impressed by how speedy they were able to reach the goal. So almost $3 million US, right? And then the money, the aid, the funding will be split between the participating mini theaters. Okay, so I want to emphasize actually there are different kind of rewarding schemes for the crowdfunders. I also donated, so I'm included. And for instance, they have opened a thanks theater where some of the crowdfunders, right, could access a streaming platform where you can view a certain number of works, okay, among the kind of hundreds of works, indie works, which are kind of made possible because the many Japanese independent filmmakers contributed and they volunteered to kind of put their films in this thanks theater for the crowdfunders to view for free, right? Of course, you donated. And I think, of course, because these low budget, independently produced films are that kind of works that you would be viewing, you would be watching in the lineup of mini theaters. Next. So I want to draw your attention to my point, right? I think to save the cinema has several layers of meanings. And what you see here in this image is the magazine covers from Eiga Geijutsu Film Art, one of the most prestigious cinema magazines. They used 2 issues to talk about the crisis of mini theaters this year. Okay, so I think I understand if the cinema is primarily about the cinema with capital C. Okay, the pandemic has given us a chance to see the systematic long-term problematics with not only the mini theaters, but also the cinema as we know it, okay? Particularly in terms of the conventional film distributing and exhibiting mechanisms, modes, and cinephiliac practices like movie going, right? You really actually going to view a film in an actual theater. So with space, I want to emphasize how the physical space in itself constitutes a kind of public sphere, and therefore save the cinema also means to save, keep, and maintain such a space of appearance. So the movie theater, mini theater, art house theaters in general should be considered not only as a physical space of film screening and social interaction, but also as an alternative place where the heterogeneous perspectives and voices are intermixed and exchanged. So maybe if you have been to one of these screenings, I think mini theaters have more juicy and well curated kind of lineups accompanied with QA sessions, sometimes a symposium, sometimes talks. So I think this is one of the core aspects of a healthy sustainable film culture. So if we are to appreciate the autonomy of mini theater as a cultural front, we need to understand how important it is to keep and maintain a space as such. And with interface, I want to emphasize how mini theater is functioning, right, in a network of different sectors, right, such as film production, distribution, and film criticism. We can imagine for a magazine like Eiga Geijutsu, if they have no mini theaters at all, it's very difficult to do a vibrant and comprehensive talk on cinema culture at all. So I would argue, however mini a mini theater is, it's always part of a regional, national, and global film network, right? And next, so I think I want to emphasize that when we look at the crisis of mini theater, we need to look at how it's in between the local and translocal and transnational, maybe. As I mentioned, right, the actual space of mini theater used to be the one and only node through which an individual spectator could connect herself translocally to a cosmopolitan film culture. Of course, nowadays, with the development of digital technologies and various distribution, streaming platforms, and digital networks, illegal ones and illegal ones, it becomes so easy for a spectator to access various types of contents and resources at home and online, so they can do this very conveniently. And at the same time, the local aspect, what you see here is a poster, a call by the local bookshops, okay, to save a mini theater, the Nagoya Cinematic I just mentioned. So I want to say that it's exactly because of the COVID crisis, the neighborhood, okay, the local, they have discovered how important a theater like this could mean to their cultural life, and vice versa. The theater realizes how important and how fundamental it is to have the local and neighborhoods support. So, okay, so I will wrap up very quickly, and next, I will jump this next. So finally, I think I just want to show a few images within 10 seconds. These are some of the new experiments initiated by the Japan-based minor distributors and film festivals, right? So what you see here are how they experiment with cloud network and digital platforms, okay? Next. So one of them is UPLINK Cloud. As you can see, you can watch the documentaries package of Wang Bing's documentaries with $12. Next. And also temporary cinema, a kind of temporary streaming platform offered by the Tongfu distributor. Okay, next. Of course, you also have the so-called stay-home mini theater, right? So all these measures are very temporary. Next. And of course, a film festival like Tokyo International Film Festival, I really appreciate how they actually launched the YouTube channel, and the director is using this channel very efficiently to communicate with audiences online. Next. And of course, we have many interesting discussions, not unlike this one now I'm participating in, right? To talk about the situation in Asia, the challenges for filmmaking and curation. Next. And very interesting kind of dialogues are going on. So thank you so much. Next. This is the end of my talk. And if you have any questions, please type it in the chat box. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maran. As always, it's an amazing presentation, and also your topic echoes to many part of Asia, including South Korea's case. Could be the Singapore, could be the China, and Taiwan. I think many will have questions to your talk. So if you have any questions, please leave your questions on YouTube and Facebook chat box. Okay, so we'll move on to our third and last speaker. So our third speaker is Sabrina Baracetti. She has many titles. She is a founding member and president of Udine Far East Film Festival, president of cultural organization CEC, head of acquisitions of Turka Film, co-founder and consultant for Ties That Bind, and member of the board of directors of Firuli Cinematheque. Sabrina was born in Udine and graduated in 1994 in literature with a thesis on Vito Pandolfi's film Gli Ultimi. Rediscovered work which helped the subsequent restoration of the film at the end of the 1990s. Since 1991, she has been involved in programming and promoting CEC activities, becoming its president in 1994. In 1998, she coordinated a retrospective dedicated to the history of Hong Kong cinema, which in 1999 evolved into Udine Far East Film Festival under her direction. She has been a member of many festival juries, as well as being a nomination advisor for the Asian Film Award. Please welcome Sabrina.
Everybody, first of all, I would love to thank Sanjong and QY to be able to get in touch with me, and I'm honored to be part of this symposium. And I was very happy to listen to the speeches just before my talk, the one by Gina Marchetti that was submitting, and also mentioned one of the that I really love so much, which is yesterday, today, tomorrow, Hong Kong. Patrick Lukong was our guest in Udine 10 years ago, so I was very happy to remember that. And of course, it was very fascinating for me to listen to this mini theater system, so I ran for that. Okay, I'm really thrilled to be here today and share with you our experience with this year's festival. As the screenwriter would say, it's all based on a true story. I will first give a short introduction of the festival, how it has been for over 20 years. I will then go on to recount how we rewrote it in the wake of the pandemic outbreak. I would like to draw a brief comparison of the two, and I will come up with the conclusions. First, what is Udine? Udine is a town in the northeast of Italy, very close to Venice. And you all know where Venice is, of course. In Udine, our city, in 1998, we held a special retrospective on new Hong Kong cinema. It was a long time ago. That was the so-called zero edition of Far East Film Festival that later became the largest European festival dedicated to popular Asian cinema, with films from China, Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Cambodia. For example, over the past last 20 years, FAF, Far East Film Festival, now I can call it FAF, was lucky enough to report on the evolution and growing popularity of the contemporary Korean cinema. FAF takes place at the end of April and usually showcases over 75 long features from, of course, from the latest box office hits to the independent gems, from cult movies to restored classic. We chose to use mainly one location, the Opera House that you can see in the picture. It's called the Teatro Nuovo Giovanni da Udine. With its 1,200 seat capacity, it has been our home and our temple for over 20 years. Here, we welcome international guests who personally introduce their films to our audience. There is always that magical moment when theater is packed, the lights are low, and the filmmaker on stage presents his film or her film, and hundreds of people are there. To that specific instant, it's a wonderful memory to all our guests, that all the guests cherish and belong with them. So that was our characteristic. Other characteristics of the festival are basically the following ones. We mostly show popular and genre Asian cinema. We invite and welcome international filmmakers, producers, talents, professionals. The festival style of the festival is very casual and informal. The audience can meet Asian guests face to face during public meetings and film presentations, and the guests themselves can be seen enjoying an ice cream downtown. It is, of course, an audience-oriented film festival. In fact, our Mulberry Awards for the best films are decided by the audience. Spectators here have a real active role. Over the year, FAF has developed also an industry section, Focus Asia, and a more educational program called Campus to train young aspiring journalists. I have to share with you what the FAF was before pandemic took over. These are the numbers of the last year's edition, so 2019. 77 films, so all over 9 days of programming, 200 film-related guests, and another 150 professionals attending our industry section. This was the past. And we can say that now the sense of the time is different, as Gina Marchetti said. Right after Berlin Film Festival, the last festival we took part in, we suddenly found ourselves in an inhospitable world. The situation back in Italy had taken a turn for the worse, and we were forced first to come up with alternative dates for the festival, thinking we could postpone the event. Then later, in the middle of the pandemic, to come up with a completely new alternative without any models to base ourselves on or any guarantee of success. In March, the virus threw all our decision and certainties up in the air. We took the decision to change location, to move on the web. It was painful and difficult, and in some ways, perhaps even reckless. After 20 years of festival and over 20 years of working in the world of cinema, our philosophy, of course, has always been that to enjoy a full and satisfying sensory experience, film needs to be seen in a movie theater on the big screen. Moving onto the web was like walking in the opposite direction and throwing a lifetime of choices into that. By the time the virus made its dramatic appearance in Italy, our selection process was almost over. We had to act extremely fast. So we contacted the agencies companies to propose this new model that not even us, not even we were actually familiar with. Most of the Asian sales agents put themselves on the line as much as we did to help. Others didn't feel that they could. Their bigger fear was piracy, a reaction that was especially common among the companies in mainland China. We choose as our technical partner My Movies, which is a platform in Italy for everybody who really are involved in love with big cinema, with whom we designed the sections and the layout of the platform that you can see in the picture, making sure that all the DRM security systems were activated and confirming the selected films. We more or less we lost 10 or 15% of the titles. Udine, Italy, would then become the world everywhere. That's the power of the web. We choose our new festival headquarters, deciding not to run the festival from the office where I'm now, but to move into a hotel in the city, one of the hotels where our guests usually during the festival stay, to ensure we took the right approach to the event. It was important that the festival team, worked in a celebrative and unique atmosphere. What we were working on was no longer the Paris Film Festival 22nd. It was the first online festival, a digital event, a truly historical edition in some way, and in some way also a revolutionary event. But the revolution wasn't just having transferred FAF onto the web. It was making FAF a totally digital event. We have completely rewrote its architecture, more formulas, editorial strategies, and at the same time preserving its main target, to investigate a continent, Asia, and to present the best of its mainstream film production. The goal was also to maintain the festival's flavor. And for this reason, we wanted very much to bring together its two sides, the event on the internet. So we kept a daily schedule, for example, with the timetable and live introduction to all films, 5 titles a day, including the late night slot. But we also set up a on-demand section, so viewers could also choose when to watch their films. Only 3 out of the 46 titles can be seen, could have seen exclusively in the time slot indicated in the program. The goal was to simulate the cinema-going experience. After purchasing their passes, the public could decide which film to see at the time indicated on the festival schedule, choose their own virtual seat in the virtual theater, watch the film, chat with all the other connected viewers, then vote to help choose the best films of the festival, the Audience Awards. To maintain the festival mood online, we also created 2 time slots for live events, introductions and talks with the directors and consultants who connected from Asia. Number 1 was an espresso with in the morning, of course, 25 minutes, and the number 2 in the afternoon was the so-called the red carpet, 5 or 7 minutes. For these live meetings, we use StreamYard. We chose StreamYard for basically 2 reasons. One is that this platform allows you to make the meetings a little more like a television with an actual direction. Second, it allows to sharing clips, pictures, and archive images. We also organize daily press conferences on Zoom with Asian directors and actors, with simultaneous translation from Asian languages and the exclusive participation of journalists. We closed the festival with an unusual midnight live award ceremony that was streamed on Facebook, and 2,600 people at the time were watching that ceremony as a conclusion of the festival. To encourage public participation, we invited users to send us a picture of their homes, of the physical and often intimate places from where they were experiencing the festival. So their personal theaters. And then we use the 100 of pictures that arrived to us to create a big gallery. As in all 2 festivals, we also published the festival catalog, which I can show you. This is the book. 300 pages of essays, interviews, and information on each film of the program. Of course, Italian, written in Italian and also in English, which once the event was finished, we sent to all the people, the pass holders, together with what we might call the festival kit. So the catalog, T-shirt, and a tote bag of the festival. So the special edition of our festival that you can also see on the picture. And here are the numbers of the special edition 2020 that you can read on the screen. And now, to the conclusion, I can say the outbreak has changed everything. We initially feared we would have to cancel the festival, but we held on and reimagined it in a completely new format. And somehow we won the challenge that these critical times demanded. The challenge to create a proper, digitally adapted formatted event and not simply to set up a digital copy of the festival. And as you can see, we strove to maintain the festival identity. We propose a daily screening schedule to recreate the festival viewing experience. We offer the audience a place to share this experience with one another. We reach people who never before participated in the festival, enlarging our audience. We welcomed our international guests, even from a distance, asked them to partake in film presentation and discussions, asked them to send us their greetings on video messages. Given all this, we are quite happy with how the transition from physical to virtual went. But of course, this can in no way replace the actual physical event. In these dramatic times, we tried to turn this situation into an opportunity and into an evolution. It is true that there is no going back. What we have experienced due to the pandemic will dictate how we can run an event in the coming years. This is not just a phase. We have worked on a successfully virtual model, and now we will get ready to the next year with a hybrid one, a festival with part physical and part virtual. And now we can see the festival trailer from this year. So thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thanks a lot for all the presentations. Thanks, Sabrina, Gina, and Maran. So with the time limit, I think we'll come straight to a Q&A session and for a discussion with all of you. So in case if anybody from the audience have questions, please do type us. I actually have one question from okay, let me see. So from Maya Kobeka, so the question is basically on film festivals, online film festivals and carbon print of film streaming, which she mentioned. So for the recent online film festivals, I think as she mentioned here, which is comparable to one inflicted by international flights before 2020, they generate a lot of carbon print as well because of the streaming. So do you see any alternatives to online film screening during the pandemic? Yeah, that's the question. I guess for Sabrina, perhaps you can, would you like to respond to that particular question?
Oh, yes. You know, I think, as I was trying to say, that this particular situation was a kind of opportunity for our film festival idea, for our perspective as a film festival organizers, because I think recently we should move on and try to make the world of internet on the web and the world of physical events combined together, and try to get the opportunity to understand how use internet skills in some way, you know, how to use the internet for our festival proposal. And we have a lot of ideas regarding that there could be something new for the festival system and for the festival historical ideas.
Okay.
For example, I can mention one thing that for us was really important during the pandemic and during that hard time when we had to take the decision to go onto web. We also realized that our festival had to have a specific platform, like a library of what the festival in more than 20 years was able to screen in the physical theater. So we decided to launch a new platform only for Italy, unfortunately, so far. We did 2 days ago. So we were just able to do that. So we created a new platform for Asian films in Italy, which is the first platform only dedicated to Asian films in our country. And I think this idea came from this year's festivals difficulties. In order to overcome all the difficulties, we came out also with something that we never thought before. So it's a kind of good thing.
Okay, I see.
Can I ask to Maran and also to Sabrina as well? Sabrina, I had a chance to visit Udine last February, right before the pandemic. I was lucky. So I went there because I was curious about Udine. I've never been to Udine. That's my dream, but I've never been there. So I visited the city. It's a beautiful city. It's not small. So the local economy is also very important for a film festival, right? So now film festivals move online. It must have made some impact on local economy. But do you think it's going to be the temporary, or you want to see the big picture? You want to see the long run. The festival will forever be online based. So I just want to hear your opinion. And to Maran. The joy of visiting Tokyo is visiting the mini theater and sit in and watch movie there. I love that. But it seems like in Tokyo, in Japan, so as I mentioned, the Demon Slayer has become the most successful a film ever in Japan. So it seems like audience are getting back to the movie theaters, but not to the mini theaters, right? So how the situation is going on? Because when I visited one of the mini theaters last year in Tokyo, I also noticed that the audiences are quite aged. So I didn't see many young cinephiles at the theater. So I was a bit sad to see that. So I was able to feel that the changes in mini theater audiences. So what do you think about the future of it? How things are going, and then where it's going?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. In terms of having a film festival in a small city like Udine, I have to say that, of course, in the future, we should try to find the way to cooperate with the local government, because the festival is actually based on the support of the local government. So in the future, the festival has to find a way to be physical. Otherwise, the city would not benefit from many other people that are used to come. So usually during the festival, all the hotels are completely packed because of the people are coming from all the part of Italy and also Europe and from Asia, of course. So this kind of situation is fundamental. So we need to recreate this for the next year, if possible, and this has to be our aim. So it's not possible to replace the physical festival with the web edition, but there is a possibility to combine the two opportunities. So trying to understand how to make a new festival like a hybrid edition, and adapt all the strategies and your editorial choices to this new model.
So it's my turn now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Sanju, for the wonderful question. Actually, you posed the same question I saved at the end of my talk, actually. And in the first place, you mentioned about the huge success, at least at the moment, of Demon Slayer. And actually, this is exactly what I'm talking about when we talk about the situation of the so-called post-studio in Japan, in relation to Japanese film industry. The thing is that, of course, the independent, all kinds of so-called non major film studio related business, they are very like active and vibrant. But at the end of the day, if you look at the both box office performance, the kind of major studios works predominantly kind of successful. So that's exactly this kind of small players. They are active, they are occupying the space, but the box office is mainly from the major players. So I think, unfortunately, however successful the Demon Slayer could be, it may never benefit the so-called mini theater or general art house theaters. And this is very sad. Again, in my talk, I mentioned if you check out the so-called ranking of the Japanese films every year, unlike the situation in South Korea, okay, almost 9 out of the 10 like best-selling films are not original works. Okay, they are just like a million times adaptation of Doraemon and something like that, right? So this is something I, as a film scholar, very like much oftentimes complain about. But of course, in terms of the ecology, a balanced ecology of film industry, this is not something bad. At the same time, like I mentioned, the mini theater, they are facing a lot of challenges too, right? So one issue, as you acutely has observed, is the issue of the aging spectatorship, right? Audience, they are. I was told that it's not like the audiences, they are old. It's just like the film-loving generation audiences, they are getting old. So unlike what I see in Korea, when I visit the film theaters, especially film festivals, Busan, Jeonju, DMZ, and so on and so forth, you see overwhelmingly a lot of younger audiences, right? So I feel so like excited, and I was like, wow, young people come to watch films, because in Japanese film festivals, you name one, like Film X, Tokyo International Film Festival, whatsoever, predominantly is like a middle age or even older generation of people go to watch films. So I think it's not the issue of a mini theater. It's just the young people they just don't watch films. Okay, so my students, some of them are international students, but the Japanese ones, they never heard about Kurosawa Akira, and not along Kurosawa Kiyoshi. No. So it's like, what? And you start from zero, something like that. They just don't watch films. They don't watch they don't go to cinema. So I think the issue is that this Save the Cinema movement is a self kind of initiated kind of let's say campaign, right? But the government has done so little compared with Korean like film council, or the situation in Europe might be slightly better. So I think now the Save the Cinema as a movement, they are negotiating with the government, right? The councilmen and the officials to negotiate for better terms of the financial aid from the state. And the process is still ongoing, and it's now unknown. I think the financial future for the mini theaters is very like gloomy, and I don't know how to persuade my students to go to cinema too. So if you know a good idea, I would do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So more broadly, I have a more general question on pandemic time, since Gina's talk on how we experience time in Hong Kong, or time is experienced very differently because of the pandemic, is such a fascinating idea. But I've been thinking, how has things changed since 2003 to 2020? So back then it was also pandemic time, but do we actually perceive things in a very different way, or? Because I was, I guess, a little too young to remember. no, I'm trying to pretend young, but yeah, yeah. So.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I could start by answering that a little bit. Yeah, it is different, and a lot of what I wanted to talk about too, and I hope it came through in my talk, was the technology. And that's what we're talking about as well in terms of exhibition, is that technology has really shaped the way in which we're experiencing time. I mean, just talking about things like streaming, the way in which we have, video on demand, for sure we had, but in a very minor way. But the transition away from cable into streaming, and services like Netflix and all of these other services that are happening now, you realize that we have a very different sense of even what cinematic time is and what kind of screens we experience it on. Cell phones, the time that we can give to our cell phone versus the time we can give to a computer screen, or the time we can give to a television screen, or the time that we're willing to sit in a movie theater. All of these different senses of time have an impact on how we're experiencing, this pandemic. And it's different from 2003 because of that. Plus, you have to realize the extent of it is completely different. That as bad as SARS was, and it was, clearly around the world, that the number of fatalities outside of Asia were fairly few. A few in Canada, a few elsewhere, but fairly few. And here this is massive, over 1 million dead. It's massive. So we've got a very different scale, and a different scale of time, because SARS was fairly contained. When COVID first happened, I had a very different sense of scale as well. I was thinking back to 2003, that it will go through one cycle, it'll be contained geographically, and it will be contained temporally, and that we won't have to worry about it beyond a typical flu season, which we are. So this sense of time, and then the idea too that it gives us a different sense of all these other cycles. Film festival cycles are completely different now. Festivals postponed and then canceled, like Sabrina was talking about. Movie theater schedules, different schedules that have to accommodate different sense of time, because there has to be fewer people in the theater if the theaters are open at all. All of these different senses of time in relationship to the cinema has got me thinking, beyond my personal experience of me and my screen, to the broader, bigger screens that, shape our life and shape our sense of time now through technology.
So, do you have any last questions for each other? Because since we are actually running a bit over time, but I guess we can, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, kind of quick questions. Will be to all of you, but also Mara and Sabrina, and also Gina. So about the audience issues, because we are watching films on Netflix and other streaming media these days, but as you can see, things are happening in many parts of the world, and the US, Hollywood, and also South Korea. Even independent films, they don't have time. They cannot find space to show their films. In Japan, mini theaters was the place for small and mini and micro films, and also Hong Kong. Also, there was small art house movie theaters, but now all those art house movie theaters are disappearing, and also film festivals go online. So many independent and art house movie, artists in the 21st century by 2020, Asia and around the world cannot find an adequate space to screen their films. They are not able to find their audiences. So onlines are not the only answer, right? Netflix is only showing mediocre genre-based films. They don't want to acquire and also streaming, serious dramas, films. So how in this the age of pandemic we are moving to, because people say that technology can change everything, so you can show your films online, so anyone can download films, anyone can share the films, but actually that's not true, right? I mean, lots of small independent productions are collapsing, and they are having really difficult times to make profit and also to show their films. So what do you think about those in the context of film festivals in Italy and Hong Kong cinema, and also in Japan?
Maybe I can start saying that in Italy and in Udine, we also run a cinema with now 5 screens. And of course, we are pretty much worried because, so far the cinema is open, but probably in the next future, we are afraid that the government will ask us to close down. But at the moment, we are still working, and we have different space also for independent local film productions. And I think this is very important for the film industry, and to be very close to what is going on around you. If the big system of big distribution around the country will be affected by a pandemic, at least we can go on doing something important for this specific region and this specific territory, which we always been trying to be supported with the local film directors and local film production. Of course, we are in a small region, but I think this kind of idea could work, especially in places like Hong Kong. And I think Gina could say more about that, to be local.
Yeah, I'm happy to pick up on that. In Hong Kong, right now, the theaters are open again with some restrictions. We also have, I think that we need to also understand that this is an acceleration of things that have been going on. And there's going to be a lot of overlap. I don't think that China just overtook the US as the largest cinema exhibition market. So more screens are open in mainland China than anywhere else on Earth. Festivals are increasingly creating films not only to circulate on physical screens, but also to go on Youku, for example. Hong Kong International Film Festival for several years has been making series of films that have been shown only first online and then in physical theaters, so that they can extend their brand beyond their local festival areas. So this has been happening already. Hong Kong also has Movie, which is kind of a niche art channel for showing films on smaller screens. So this has been going on at the same time as there's been an expansion of, as you pointed out, the larger commercial market through Netflix, etc. So there's always these niche areas. I wanted to also mention Degenerate Films, which has a streaming service, its own kind of mini streaming service. So there's a lot of these like niche mini streaming services that I think the one in Udine, I'm hoping it'll be quite successful there because it sounds like a really good idea. I don't think that people who are normally have the habit of cinema going are going to give that up so easily. Going out for a community event, maybe seeing a speaker if it's an art film, or going out with your friends and then having dinner or whatever as a social event. I think cinema has become more and more that kind of event. that you're going to find that increasingly too, people are going to go to smaller and even smaller screens. Forget about seeing it on the big screen or in a mini theater or on your computer screen. People are watching films on cell phones, and that filmmakers are going to be embracing that. Look at how they've embraced even making Zoom films because of the pandemic. I mean, we're going to see an outpouring both of creativity as well as limitations. So I think that no one has a crystal ball in terms of, where we're going to go with cinephilia. I think that what we're going to have is an expansion of a love of different types of images on different kinds of screens and a different way of thinking through our film heritage. I was really unhappy to hear, Maran, about your students not knowing either Kurosawa and not, watching those films, because I think that we really are going to have or should have an embrace of our older film heritage. That's why I was so happy to see that we were doing Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, which has been one of the most heavily censored films in Hong Kong film history, that we were showcasing it again, even if it is in a truncated form. People embracing their history and having film festivals get people in touch with that history is so important.
Gina's Maran, please.
10 minutes. I totally agree what Sabrina and Gina have offered for us to think about. I just want to add that it seems that for the Japanese mini theater exhibitors, right, they feel like they can no longer go back to the pre-pandemic time, and this kind of chronicle death, right, slow death has been in the coming, right? They see that, but at the same time, I think I totally agree that you cannot just do everything online. You need this in the morning. People are talking about affect, right? About this kind of sentiment, about the bonding, and so on and so forth. So I cannot see myself in a virtual film festival and enjoy that kind of physical interactions. So I feel like as a film festival studies scholar, I still want to have a physical film festival, but of course the world is changing. And yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, just one note, Busan Film Festival has just started last Wednesday. Although the programming is has international scope, the festival itself has become a local because only local audiences can attend and no international guests. And then most of those forums are also being conducted in Korean language only. So pretty sad to see that, but actually, but at least the film festival is happening on site. So we are really living in a really interesting time, or at the same time very frustrating time. But we have to see the bright new future. We have to embrace what we are having and where we are heading toward.
So yeah, thank you so much. I wish we could continue with the conversation, but because of the time, let us thanks Gina, Maran, and Sabrina again. Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So, thanks everybody in the audience for joining us today as well. So I guess as a very brief concluding note, as we see, well, we are in an inhospitable world, but as you see the title, in, it's actually bracketed in IN, and as a lot of our speakers have shown, there are actually new creativities, new opportunities, and new ways of thinking that is actually generated by the kind of situation we are in. So I hope the day's event have actually triggered you to think more about it as well. And before we end, I would like to really thank all the speakers that have participated today, and also our moderators and all the staff behind the scene, particularly AFA's team. So I would really like to, and also definitely thank all of you to participate in this online symposium. So also thanks Cairo.
Thank you
for being with me.
Well, thank you for inviting me. So just to quickly wrap up, UPLINK will be showing tonight at 8 p.m. So you could hurry up and get your tickets. Ohong Village is no longer showing in theaters, but it's available on video on demand. And Mekong 2030 will be shown here at Oldham Theatre on the 14th and 22nd of November. So remember to catch these films. And these films were part of the were directed by the directors that were in conversation with us in the second panel. So thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you someday, probably face to face.
Okay, yeah, thank you.